All right, everybody. Thanks for bearing with us. Thank you for being patient. It is time to get the Lunchtime Discovery series started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the show. I am your host, Chris Smith. I'm curator for the Daily Planet Theater here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. This program is broadcast by us here at the museum, but it is organized, promoted, and generally well looked after by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality. They're amazing collaborators in this endeavor of getting interesting topics out there to environmental educators, scientists, professionals all across the state of North Carolina and even beyond, and in bringing interesting people for us to meet as well every Wednesday here at noon as part of this program. Today, of course, is going to be no different. I'll remind everybody that as we go throughout today's presentation on the amazing plants, are they plants? Lichens of North Carolina. Gary's already
You'll find
laughing.
out soon enough.
We're going to find out soon enough. As we learn more about these, drop your comments and your questions into the chat box there on YouTube. That way, at the end of today's presentation, I can pull those up and pose your questions to today's guest, who you've heard laughing at my bad joke about lichens, is Gary Perlmutter. Gary is an associate with the UNC Herbarium and an expert on the amazing things that are lichens, as I understand it. Gary, welcome to the show.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone, for hosting this presentation. Hope to teach you folks a little something about the little organisms that grow on trees, rocks, and soil, and everything that they can. These are lichens, and I'll go ahead and share my screen to show you what we're talking about.
Let's jump right into it.
Sure. And okay, so I'm sharing, and these get back into the presentation mode. So one moment, please. There we go.
I've got a lot of button clicks myself today.
Okay, just one of those days. So anyway, as Chris had said, my name is Gary Perlmutter. I've been interested in lichens since the 1990s while studying plants in Southern California. That's where I'm originally from. But it wasn't until I came here to North Carolina in 2003 that I was really floored by the diversity of lichens that we have here in our state. So I pretty much taught myself everything I could about lichen diversity, and in so doing, I've been compiling checklists, reports, and teaching workshops just like this one to interested folks from time to time. And so with this, I'll go ahead and show you what we're talking about. So unlike other organisms in our environment, this is something a little unusual. I mean, lots of people have to, not everyone has to ask what is a plant or what is an animal. But when it comes to lichens, we do have to ask that question. What exactly is a lichen? And so the concepts of what lichens are have changed over time. Back in the early days, they were first considered to be related to mosses and therefore plants. And functionally, they are like plants. They do carry photosynthesis and live sedately. They don't move around like animals or eat things or decompose like fungi. But then later on, kind of like in the mid-1800s, we started to get a clearer view of what lichens actually were. And at first, the similarities between lichens and fungi, as well as algae, were recognized. And William Nylander from Europe had placed lichens as an intermediate form between algae and fungi. But it wasn't until Simon Schwendener in 1867 who developed the dual hypothesis that lichens are actually symbiosis of fungi and algae. So that led to the traditional concept of a lichen, which is a symbiosis of a fungus and a photosynthetic partner, whether that be a green alga or a cyanobacterium. And how this works is that the fungus provides the structure of the organism while the algae provide the food through photosynthesis. And so it's been considered, so it's been argued or debated as to still what exactly a lichen is. Is it a controlled parasitism? Is it a mutualism? Or is it something more complex like an ecosystem? Well, with the advent of molecular technology and DNA analysis, we've come to find out that lichens are indeed the latter part. In fact, I just found out this morning of a paper that came out just last year that redefined lichens as a self-sustaining ecosystem formed by the interaction of an exhabitant fungus and an extracellular arrangement of one or more photosynthetic partners and an indeterminate number of other microscopic organisms. In other words, it's complicated. So in general, a lichen is pretty much a composite organism or an ecosystem consisting of the primary fungus, its photosynthetic partner, and other partners such as other types of fungi, as well as bacterial colonies. And in some cases, you got other, protists and other organisms that are involved in the mix. So let's look at the primary symbiosis between the fungus and the alga. And basically, you can separate the two partners and grow them in the lab, and they look quite different from the whole lichen, or what we consider the holobiont. And synthesis of lichens from these two partners has proven difficult in the laboratory. However, it has been done on a few occasions, and recent studies have shown that it was the other partners, such as bacteria, that help aid in forming the association of the lichen and between the fungus and the alga, as well as chemical interactions between the two symbionts to form the structure that we know as a lichen. So the primary symbionts include the fungus, which we consider the mycobionts, and they are primarily in the group Ascomycota, or the sac fungi, as can be shown in the sac-like reproductive structures here. And also we have the Basidiomycota, which are mushroom fungi that can also form lichens, but it's very small percentage. The algal partner, or the photobiont, is a little more diverse at the higher levels. We have chlorophytes, mostly the green algae. We also have 10% lichens that include cyanobacteria. And we also have a few species that include other types of algae, such as golden algae and brown algae. And those are primarily in coastal or maritime species. So looking at the photobionts, we have quite a variety of algae and cyanobacteria that are found within lichens. The most common species, or the most common genera, include Trabauxia, which is a chlorococcoid green alga, followed by Trentipolia, which is a filamentous alga that has orange bodies and therefore looks orange under the microscope. Also, among cyanobacteria, the most common genera include the Cyctonema, which have sheathed filamentous colonies, as well as Nostoc, which look like a string of pearls. And some lichens contain both types of photobionts. These are considered tripartite lichens, or three-part lichens. And they come in two forms. One of them would be a normally green lichen, or green algal lichen, that has cyanobacteria in little pockets called cephalodium. And in this arrangement, the green alga provides the photosynthesis, whereas the cyanobacteria provides nitrogen fixation. In other words, they grab the nitrogen from the air and they convert it into usable forms such as ammonia and nitrogen oxides. Another form that lichens can use in a tripartite sense is what are called chimeras or photosymbiotemes. In other words, you have two morphological forms of the same lichen depending on the photobiont. As shown here in this Sticta genus, you have a thallus, a large green leafy thallus that is dominant with the green alga, whereas you see the smaller dark thallus growing right out of it, that is the cyanomorph. And these have shown to be advantageous ecologically, allowing the lichen to exploit a greater variety of habitats than if it were just to have only one type of photobiont in its arsenal. Such as in this canyon study, the chloromorph form of the lichens are found on the more exposed and sunny areas of the canyon, whereas deeper in the shady parts, you are having the cyanomorphs being dominant there. And in between, you have a mix of both types. Looking at it more specifically within a lichen thallus, this diagram here on the left is a cutaway of a of a foliose or a green leafy lichen, and in that the top layer you have an upper cortex, which is a protective layer, and it includes some crystals and sun shielding pigments, and these aim to protect the photobiont layer or the photobiont from harmful UV radiation. Also in the cortex, you do have some openings so you can have some gas exchange. So therefore, the photobiont as well as parts of the microbiome can respire and carry out metabolism that way. In the photobiont layer, you have a layer of the green algae or other algae, and this is where the photosynthesis takes place, whereas the with the carbohydrates that are produced from the photosynthesis move across cell walls from the alga to the fungus, and therefore the fungus uses that for its nutrition, whereas the algae is able to retain some of its photosynthase for its own metabolism as well. Further down, we have the medulla, which is basically a loose, spongy layer of hyphae, and it's just strictly fungal in that regards. And below that, you have a lower cortex, which is composed of dense cellular material, again, all fungal, and they also provide some some melanin pigments, which also act to protect from UV radiation. Now, looking at the other communities in 2012, or the early 21st century, Brendan Hodgkinson out of the Duke University had performed some DNA analysis on a variety of lichen species, and he was able to find, strictly through the genetic work, entire communities of bacteria. And these are unique communities that are not found elsewhere, but found only in the lichens. And they were also found widespread in many types of lichens, and so therefore they have been shown to be an integral part of the consortium. And so with that, it was later found out that the bacterial communities within the lichen thallus or the lichen body at first developed from the surrounding environment. But as the lichen grows and develops, the bacterial communities themselves develop and become more distinct from the surrounding environment. And that's just due to individual preferences of individual bacterial types within the lichen microenvironment. That is kind of like the microbiome, not unlike our gut flora. On the other hand, we also have a lichen microbiome, and this is the other types of fungi that are growing both on and in lichens. We have lichenicolous fungi with over 1,800 species known, and they have been known for a while, and many of them are host specific, such as in the picture here, you have this Bauauxia lichenicola. They appear as black dots on the thallus of this rim lichen. But if you look inside, you will see that this is actually a fruiting body, and it develops its own spores and reproduces on its own. But it doesn't seem to be harming the host very much, and tends to be live as a commensal. In fact, most lichenicolous fungi form local infection or live as commensals, and therefore very few of them cause death to the host. Another type of another type of fungi growing within the lichen microbiome are endolichenic fungi. These have been recently discovered through DNA analysis and were originally considered to be considered to be contaminants from the outlying environment, but through extensive study of varieties of lichens, they found out that these endolichenic fungi are widespread. They're found in every lichen that has been searched, including fossils. And they also provide some secondary metabolites, which are chemicals that the lichen consortium can use to defend itself against herbivory as well as competition. But what really threw the two-partner concept on its head was the discovery of a yeast partner in 2016. What happened is that there are some hair lichens out in the West that are considered two different species. You have Bryoria fremontii, which is a brown hair lichen, and it is considered edible, whereas you have another species, Bryoria tortuosa, which is pale in color and is known to be toxic. Toby Sprabile out of the University of Montana had investigated these two species molecularly, and he found out that the microbiome is the same species. So it's really kind of like two lichens of a different flavor. But what he also found out is that there are these yeast partners that are growing within the thallus, in the cortex, the upper protective layer, in certain lichens, and they are the ones that are responsible for the toxicity in the yellow lichens. Now, as you can see, why is this considered two species and not one species, as the microbiome is the same? Well, that's because the lichen ecosystem, the name applies kind of like to the phenotypic expression of the entire holobiont. And so in this case, we have the additional partner forming additional characters, and therefore it's a separate species as far as a lichen. And so that brings us to how lichens are named. And as I mentioned before, the name strictly applies to the microbiome, except for this case that we just saw. But this is how it's been done traditionally. Back in the day, there was an attempt to create a naming system of lichens involving both the microbiome and the photobiont, but it turned out to be quite cumbersome and hard to maintain, so that was generally dropped, and therefore it remains that we apply the taxonomy of a lichen to just the microbiome. And so therefore, lichens are classified as lichenized fungi. So, considering the great variety of partners within a lichen, the actual outer morphology of a lichen also varies quite a bit too. We have a variety of growth forms, and the three primary ones that you typically hear of are crustose, which is crust-like, foliose, which are leaf-like, and fruticose, that are shrub-like. As you can see, we have a few other different types as well, and each one has its own special terminology to help describe the lichen. Not only that, but we also have special terminology to help describe what lichens grow on, such as soil, bark, moss, and leaves. So most of the lichens that we'll run into here in North Carolina are either growing on soil, on bark, or on rock. Those that are found on wood, leaves, and moss are more specialists. You probably see more growing on wood than on moss or leaves, but you do see some growing on those substrates as well. And if that weren't enough, they can grow on all sorts of things, provided the substrate is stable enough. In fact, have lichens growing on pine cones, on glass bottles, roadways, cars, abandoned cars, and even Galapagos tortoises. And if we wanted to apply some descriptive terminology, we can say that lichens growing on cars are vehiculous. Not only do lichens grow on everything, but they grow everywhere. They are found on all terrestrial habitats and a few aquatic ones here on Earth. And such as in the Antarctic region, we only have 3 species of plants growing on that continent. However, we have upwards to about, dozens of species of lichens. So they tend to be pretty hardy. And what makes their such a success is what is considered is what we call poikilohydry. In other words, lichens will just shut down under harsh environments and just wait out for things to become more favorable again. And case in point, the European Space Agency had taken some lichens and they planted them onto the outer hull of the International Space Station and left them out there experimentally for a couple weeks. After which they brought them back to Earth, re-wetted them, and they came back to life as if nothing ever happened. So this, life strategy of poikilohydry is really essential. But despite their hardiness, lichens are also rather sensitive to pollution, in particular air pollution. And why that is because being, functionally air plants, they receive all of their nutrition from the atmosphere, either as dry deposition directly from the air or through rain. And therefore, they are susceptible to air pollutants, most particularly sulfur dioxides, nitrogen oxides, and metals. And the lichen sensitivity to air pollution has been known for well over 200 years, as was first noted by Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, who noted that lichens are not growing near sulfurous areas, creating a desert. Effects of lichen pollution on lichens include bioaccumulation, tissue damage, and reduction in populations and communities. And therefore, they can be used as indicator organisms, kind of like canaries in a coal mine. So to give a few examples of that, one study out in western Tennessee, just beyond our border, there is a area called Copper Hill, wherein there was a copper mine and a smelter, which produced a lot of sulfur dioxide. And this had created a denuded environment known as the Copper Hill Desert, and it had stretched for quite a distance here in southeastern Tennessee. Tom Mather, who later became the PIO for the Division of Air Quality, conducted a transect study from the NC border along Highway 64 for about 16 kilometers, noting the lichens on the trees and how many were growing at certain distances. And what he found out was that you have greater numbers of lichens growing further away from the Tennessee border and thus from the pollution source. And he found out that beard lichens in the genus Usnea, which are these fruticose bushy lichens were the best indicators of environmental quality, that is air quality. Another study involves temporal studies, that is lichens looked at over time. And there was a long-term study conducted by James Lowry of George Mason University, looking at the common rock shield lichen known as Flavopomelia baltimorensis in Maryland and Virginia. And what he did was at periodic times he would take thalli and he would analyze them for elements such as sulfur, lead, and other metals. And he found out that over time, from the late 70s to all the way to the early 90s, that certain elements, in particular sulfur and lead, have gone down considerably. And remember, I mentioned that lichens are taking in these pollutants with the air, so as part of their nutritional strategy. And so, with lichens finding lower concentrations of these pollutants later on in time, is clear evidence that our regulations toward air pollution is working, and therefore the skies are clearing up. During my time with the Division of Air Quality, I conducted a study looking at the lichens in Raleigh, North Carolina, which we're hailing from. And the general premise was that I wanted to test a hypothesis that as you go further away from the city center, you would find more lichens. And so I looked at 16 sites in the Raleigh area, plus one site over at Mason Farm Biological Reserve in near Chapel Hill as a control. And I looked at just one tree, just to control for bark variation. And that one tree is a willow oak, and that is a widely planted native tree that is found throughout the triangle, and it also grows, in bottomland forests. So what I did is I counted the lichens and I estimated their coverage at all of these sites, and first tried to test my hypothesis based on a calculated estimate called the lichen diversity value. However, that didn't really show up very well. So I then looked at some surrogate parameters for pollutants, such as population density for ammonia and traffic volume for nitrogen oxides. And what I found out was that when you look at the total species, that is not just the macrolichens, but also the crustose lichens, I found a positive correlation between species number and both surrogate parameters. And also, what I found out was that this group of 5 species were the most common ones in our urban areas, such as the candle flame lichen, which is well known as a nitrogenous or a nitrophilous lichen that really thrives under high nitrogen environments. Also, Physia milligrana, which is the mealy rim lichen that has also been reported to be among the most pollution tolerant species. Pyxine subcinerea, a mustard lichen that is here described as pollution tolerant, as well as these 2 larger lichens, the common green shield lichen, Flavopomelia caparata, and the speckled shield lichen, Punctilia rudecta, which are less tolerant of highly polluted areas. Also, in the most heavily polluted areas, that is those that are closest to the busiest streets, I found the fewest number of lichens with only about 4 species total. Whereas in the more distant areas, in particular in the control area, I found roughly about 20 species. So looking at that a little more specifically at roadway pollution, I conducted another study, a transect study, looking with a couple of transects placed on either side of I-40. and also a controlled transect placed in a rural area by Harris Lake to represent background air quality. And what I found out here was that indeed a similar pattern is that further away from the road forest interface, I would find more lichens, but close to it, I only found just 4 species. And overall, I would find as many as 20 species furthest away within the highway transects, whereas in the controlled site, I found twice as many species, including a handful of pollution-sensitive cyanolichens. Now, if that weren't evidence enough, I also took passive measurements of nitrogen oxides through these filtered passive monitors. And I set them out along the transects in each site. And then after getting those concentrations, I would plot the data against the lichen numbers, and I found an even stronger correlation between these parameters than I did using surrogate parameters in the Raleigh study. So speaking of lichen diversity, just how many lichens are there? Well, we have a global estimate of over 250,000 species, and with over 18,000 already described. And we're discovering species all the time. Case in point is this one paper that came out in 2011, wherein 100 scientists had proposed or described 100 new species of lichens in one publication. One of them, and these are from all over the world, but one of them, Acarospora jani, was also representative of North Carolina. It was first described from Las Vegas, New Mexico, and at the time of this publication, it was only represented by two collections. One way back, the original type collection from 1820, and a recent North Carolina collection collected in 2009. And so it brought to a lot of questions like, how can you explain this? Well, through further research and investigations of collections and field surveys, some gaps were being filled. So it just demonstrates that this lichen, as well as many lichens, are just simply overlooked. In the neotropics, because of the understudied nature and cryptic nature of lichens, there is an estimated 3,000 species yet to be discovered. Here in North America, we have over 5,600 species in Canada and the US, with over 1,000 species reported in several American states, such as Alaska, California, and here in North Carolina. North Carolina has also reported to have 2 biodiversity hotspots, one in the Smoky Mountains and another one along the coast in the Dare Peninsula, which is over by the Alligator River and Roanoke Island. So lichen diversity is being tracked through the North Carolina Biodiversity Project, and we have a website here that is maintained through collections and observations, as well as publications. And here, if you go onto the website, you'll come to this homepage, and in the fields here, you can just type in a name, whether it be the scientific name or the common name, and it'll show up a species page showing a picture in most cases, as well as its description, as well as its distribution within North Carolina. Now, overall, we have an estimated 1,500 species in our state. And as you can see, again, the greatest concentration or the greatest diversity is out in the mountains. We also have a relatively high concentration or high diversity along the coast. And we do have also a relatively high diversity in the triangle. And the areas in between aren't so well populated by lichens, or you would think by looking at this map. Instead, it's really reflective of collection intensity. So you don't have so many people, collecting around here in the Northeast or, in the Southwest in the Upper Piedmont. But, and that's just mostly because um, if you notice, some universities' locations also have lots of high collecting intensity. However, there are indeed some rare lichens out there, and these are being tracked by the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program through their list of rare plant species that is produced about every 2 years. And here, the most recent one, we have one federally endangered species and a handful of significantly rare species. And the federally endangered species is rock gnome lichen. And this species is a habitat specialist found only on rocks within the high elevation habitats of the southern Appalachians, not just in North Carolina, but also South Carolina, northern Georgia, as well as eastern Tennessee. And not only is this federally listed, but it is also red listed by the International Union of Conservation for Nature. And this website keeps a running tab of all the at-risk species, as well as some species that have been determined to be either extinct or having stable populations. And so this is a good source for rare lichens if you want to find out where they are. Another rare lichen here in North Carolina is the Carolina moon lichen. And as you can see, as with the general map that we saw earlier, we have populations primarily in the mountains, along the coast, and a few here in the triangle. It could be more widespread if people looked in other areas. And finally, we have conservation concerns for many lichens, and not only are they susceptible to air pollution, but they're also susceptible to the effects of global warming. And these threats are also listed on a species red list page on the IUCN. And so the threats by global warming includes increased fire frequencies out in the west. As you know, we're having some major fires, and there was a study that was done just recently published that demonstrates that a climax community of old growth chaparral takes about 75 to 100 years to fully develop in just for its lichen community. And therefore, if you have increased fire frequency, they're having a harder time of recovery. Also, on a larger scale, you have shifting ranges that has been reported from Europe, in particular in the Netherlands. There was a study that was conducted lichen long-term biomonitoring stations, which were originally placed to track air pollution. And they found out instead that as the air cleans up, the lichen species numbers are increasing, but the composition is different. In other words, the more boreal species or the cooler species are not recovering as well. However, you're finding more species coming in that have more southerly distributions. And so therefore we have like a general increase of range expansion of southerly species to northern species or to more northern latitudes. And this is also being found not just in the Netherlands, but in neighboring countries such as Germany, England, and Switzerland. Another global warming threat is sea level rise. For example, during the Hurricane Katrina, it was found that the trees had demonstrated or shown what are called lichen lines, and this shows the elevation of how high the flooding was. And so in general, as you can see, lichens don't like water or fire. So, and another threat is with ghost forests. of the Dare Peninsula and other parts of eastern North Carolina, as well as along the coast in general. In other words, you just have saltwater intrusion going into the forest. It's killing the trees, creating the ghost forest, and it's putting the lichen communities at risk as those habitats change from forest to ghost forest to salt marsh. A modeling study was done um, fairly recently that predicted that under about maybe 3 to 6 inches of sea level rise, lichens could be losing upwards to about maybe 30% or more of their distribution range. But let's take a look at the lichens that we have here in the triangle. We have quite a variety of species of all primary growth forms, including crustose, foliose, and fruticose. And among the crustose lichens, we have a great diversity here, which is primarily dictated by the morphology of their fruiting bodies, such as in the common lichens, you see just little squiggles, which are the fruiting bodies. Or among pox lichens, you have these black pustule-like organs. And also we have some dust lichens, which don't have any fruiting bodies, but they instead reproduce through what are called spiridia, which are these minuscule packets that include both the fungi and the algae together, and they'll just drift off and until they land a new suitable habitat and grow their own lichen. Also, we have more varieties of fruiting bodies, such as rim lichens that have the rimmed, the classic rim shape apothecium. That's the technical term for the fruiting body. And we also have button lichens, which have these, these broad black discs. And also we have script lichens that can be elongated, as well as wort lichens, which have their fruiting bodies within thalline worts. Among foliose lichens, we also have a variety here, and we have these include ruffle lichens, green shield lichens, rosette lichens, candle flames, as well as some cyanolichens, such as jelly skins. And these are primarily identified through not just color and shape, but also through chemical properties, as well as some microscopic features or smaller features, such as isidia, which are finger-like projections that serve as vegetative propagules, which can barely be seen here in some of these species, but not so much. And so just basically the color, shape, size, and type of reproduction that helps identify different types of lichens. Common lichens, the fruticose variety includes strap lichens, which kind of look like cartilage growing on trees. We also have beard lichens, which are rather bushy, and they can also be pendant or hanging. And we also have quite a variety of cladonias that are growing on the ground. And these can be either truly fruticose and highly branched, such as these reindeer lichen. They can have like these upright projections called Boeotia, where on top sits the fruiting bodies or apothecia, such as in these British soldiers. And we also have some that look like Dr. Seuss cups, and they're known as pixie cups. In fact, Cladonia is one of the largest genera in the world, and at least in North Carolina, we have at least 50 species within our state. So in summary, lichens are really complex ecosystem type organisms with many different partners playing a role, both living in and on the lichen thallus. However, they are classified as lichenized fungi, so we can have some sense of how to name and organize lichens, phylogenetically. But regarding that, lichens are quite variable in their growth form, and they are found everywhere, and they are very, very hardy organisms, being able to withstand the rigors of space. And despite that, they are also vulnerable to air pollution as well as climate change due to their life strategy of receiving nutrition directly from the atmosphere. And so, therefore, they can be used as indicators of environmental health, and also they are important for conservation. So, with that, I will take any questions.
All right. Everybody, let's give Gary a great big round of applause and say thanks. Incredible stuff. Wow. Okay. I mean, you blew my mind when you said that there were at a minimum of 250,000 species of lichenized fungi around the world. But it was also really exciting to hear that North Carolina is kind of a hot spot with 1,400 species. Like, that's just a cool thing to know about our state.
Yes, it is. And yeah, we got all different types growing there too. So, and in fact, you can have all sorts of lichens growing in your backyard. In fact, I live here in South Durham, and just looking at the trees and the fallen branches, I've got a working checklist of about 40 species just from my backyard.
Wow, really impressive. I know this has given me a new appreciation. I feel like I'm just going to be walking down the street and seeing lichen just everywhere now.
Yeah, well, they are everywhere. So
They are everywhere. Early in the
yeah.
presentation, I was going to ask you, is there any place on Earth that we know of, I guess besides like underwater, where lichen don't grow
Well, highly polluted
or live?
areas. Yeah, yeah. So those are called lichen deserts. I'm sure if you go to downtown cities. I remember I've flown out to California a couple times, and I've just taken looks at the trees out there in Los Angeles, and I didn't see anything growing there. So primarily heavily urbanized areas and industrial sites.
Gotcha. Makes sense, I suppose. Let's get some questions from the chat. Gary, you ready?
Sure.
All right, the first one that came up is from Melissa, who wants to know if you have a lichen named after you.
No, I don't.
All right,
But it's
we'll get
just a
on
matter
that.
of time. I do have a buddy in the lichenological world, and we have a pact that if we discover and name a new species, we're going to name it after each other.
Soon, very soon then.
Yes, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah. Okay, let's see. Renee wanted to know what are good ways to identify lichens. I never think to photograph them for iNaturalist, but would those observations be helpful?
Well, actually, I have taught a few classes that use iNaturalist. So yes, cell phone cameras are getting really great in resolution. So if you're able to get a close-up shot of a lichen, you should be able to get a fairly good identification of it, at least a genus.
Oh, wow. That's now iNaturalist has that great artificial intelligence tool that can kind of automatically fill stuff in. Do you know if that works really well for lichens yet?
Uh, yes, it does. Yes and no. But the other really cool thing about iNaturalist is that it's also community based. So, like,
Yeah,
you post your
exactly.
picture, the AI gives you an idea of what it could be. If you don't know, you'll just say, "Yeah, I think it's this," and then someone else will look at it because this is live, and they may give their own interpretations. Go like, "No, I think it's something else," and there are, they can also give comments as to why they think it is.
There you go. Good one. All right, let's see here. Next one. If folks are interested in contributing by gathering lichen samples, how would one submit the data? And should people go out and collect?
Well, there is a couple of general rules of thumb when it comes to collecting lichens. First and foremost, if it's not in your backyard, you have to get permission from the landowner or land management agency. In particular, like if you're in a state park or a federal park, you absolutely have to get permission from the park organization. But the good news is that if you are looking to build like a checklist of a park, staff are very excited about that sort of thing. So they'd be happy to give you a permit. So if you're in a public area such as a park, you would need to contact park personnel and ask if you can fill out a permit for collecting or research purposes. And the other rule of thumb when it comes to collecting lichens is that you just want to preserve, you don't want to collect everything that you see, but you want to leave, a good amount of the population intact so it can just continue to grow. Because sometimes you have some rare lichens that you just don't see very often, but other lichens are very common, and you can collect those, without damaging the population.
Excellent stuff. All right. Are there any reddish lichens, and is the color of a lichen an indicator of anything?
Good questions indeed. As far as reddish lichens, yes, there are a few. There's this one red button lichen called Ramboldia. I've collected it here in the triangle, and there is another reddish lichen known as the Christmas lichen, which is found out on the coast. It's known as Herpethalon rubrocinctum. And that's in a very aggressive crust. It's actually just a crustose lichen, but it grows so fast it'll grow over foliose lichens and other species. But it is characterized by having a red and green color. Very pretty.
All right, our next viewer wants to know, after storms, I often find pieces of pine bark with lichen on it blown down on the ground. Is there anything I can do to save the lichen?
I would say just leave them where they are. I mean, if they were a canopy species, they probably cannot survive on the ground for long. But actually, if you keep them in an elevated spot, they may be able to last longer. In fact, that reminds me of a study that was done in Florida not too long ago, where a tree had toppled down but didn't fall completely. The trunk was maintained at about maybe 2 meters up. And so therefore, in its semi elevated position, a lot of the lichens were able to survive.
Oh, interesting. That's an interesting study to do, I feel like.
Yeah.
Pay attention to down trees for that. Okay, let's see. Mike Dunn writes, can Gary talk about lichens' role in the ecosystem and their relationship to other organisms? And what about interspecies competition between lichens growing next to each other?
Good questions. Well, first of all, lichens are primary producers, just like plants. And so at the trophic level, they're the ones that conduct the photosynthesis and they function like plants. And as far as the ecosystem is concerned, they provide food for animals, nesting for insects and birds, and also they provide nitrogen to the environment through the nitrogen fixation of cyanobacteria within the cyanolichens. Now, as far as competition is concerned, there are some lichens that, especially the crustose lichens, because they only grow in two-dimensional space, they will put up these walls or barriers or what we call contact lines. So like if you go onto a tree and you see a bunch of lichens and you see a bunch of these lines, those are individual phalli building up their barriers and you can't grow any further. And however, there are some other fast-growing lichens, such as foliose lichens, that can grow over the crustose lichens. And so in that, especially if you look at twigs, you can see a pattern of succession from primary colonizers on the newest twigs, whereas you'll see a change toward larger lichens on larger branches and trunks.
Excellent stuff. All right, let's see here. There's just a few remaining. Let's see. A viewer, Alma, is asking, are there other plants that are poecilohydric?
Yes, poikilohydric.
Poikilohydric.
Yes, I
Thank
know.
you.
It's It's a funny word. Yes, mosses are. Mosses are poikilohydric, but they are not as much as lichens are. Particularly with the chlorolichens, they can, go completely into a torpor-like state, but they can become physiologically active during the photosynthesis in just humid conditions. Whereas cyanolichens and bryophytes, such as the mosses and liverworts, they need to be wet in order to come back to life and be active metabolically.
All right, and then are there any other, like you mentioned that iNaturalists might be all right for lichens. Holly's writing that they've had less good luck with iNat and lichen. Are there any other good apps or maybe field guides that you'd recommend?
Well, of course, there is the Lichens of North America, the big book that came out in 2001. It may be largely out of print, but you may be able to find that in Amazon.com. Other sources include there was a field guide that came out of lichens of these Great Smoky Mountains, produced by the New York Botanical Garden. And there's also some other regional lichen handbooks or field guides, but they primarily, like the northeastern and the northwestern. So they're primarily just for area specific. But I think for our area, the closest one would be for the Smokies.
All right, and let's see, the last one that I see, oh wait, I think I've got two more here.
Okay.
Have you ever used lichens for anything like dyeing fabric or to snack on?
No, I haven't. I do have a colleague that does dyeing, and she's even taught a course in how to dye lichens. So that's pretty interesting. And lichens have been used as dye for millennia among various cultures. As far as eating lichens, I would not recommend it. In fact, we have a lichen listserv, and there was this one person that made a post, proposing that he was going to trek across Asia and he was going to live nothing but on lichens, and he wanted some advice on what kind to eat. And just about everyone said that's a bad idea. You don't want to do that because lichens in general are nutritionally marginal. You're going to starve if you just eat lichens, and more importantly, some of them are toxic. So, it's kind of like mushrooms. If you don't know what you're eating, you're rolling the dice.
Yeah, probably just posting the listserv is not going to be enough research to get you going.
Right.
For sure. All right, and then I'm going to give the last question to Troy because Troy went existential with it. If lichens are ecosystems, Gary, what's your perspective on this? Aren't our bodies with all of our symbionts also ecosystems?
That got me to thinking about that as well. And with the microbiome and the microbiomes, it could very well be that, everything's an ecosystem. The concept of the individual doesn't really apply, or does it apply? So that's a good question. It's a very good question. And I think that's something that will be, debated for time.
Agreed. Excellent answer. Well, Gary, thank you so much for being on today's program and presenting as part of the Lunchtime Discovery Series. I think this has given everybody a great new perspective on the world around them.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, everyone out there. And, go out and see what you can find.
All right, everybody. So I'll remind you all that next week on Wednesday at noon, we'll be meeting the museum's head of paleontology, Dr. Lindsay Zano, who is actually in the field in Utah right now digging up dinosaurs. Dr. Zano is going to join our call from the field, from their dig site in Utah. So we'll get the latest updates on this year's paleontology field season directly from the head of paleontology, Dr. Lindsay Zano. They've been finding some pretty interesting stuff. She's been posting some pictures on Twitter. It looks like it's been very hot, but they've also been having a great field season. So you don't want to miss that. It's always really exciting to get the latest, greatest updates from the dig sites. That's next Wednesday at noon. We're going to hope that everything works out. The cell service for a broadcast from the middle of the desert in Utah can be a little spotty, and I'll actually be broadcasting to you from a National Park Service office in the Blue Ridge Mountains next week, so that's going to be fun. It's going to be a very interesting presentation, I think. You won't want to miss out. That's next Wednesday at noon. You can get the information by visiting naturalsciences.org for the YouTube link, or make sure that you're following the Office of Environmental Education on Twitter. They're at North Carolina EE. So that'll wrap up today's show. Thanks everybody for tuning in and for being patient as we got a little bit of a late start. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. And remember, we're still in this, so take care, stay safe, and keep your community safe. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.